Hello, Jeando.
Good morning, Kevin.
Good morning. So in our last video, you were talking about Alexander's idea of bending the knee in the new way, and it's in a couple of places in his books, I think. And you explained your understanding of the model he's using in order to bend the knee in the new way, using the hips and the knees using the hips and knees as hinges, but not moving the ankle. So when you saw the model that you showed, this seems to clash with the idea in the modern Alexander technique world of knees forward and away, because it looks like the knee isn't going forward. So where does knees forward and away? That's a common direction you hear. Where does that fit in with the bending the knee in the new way, and how is the knee moving? Which part of the knee? What does it mean, knees forward and away?
Yeah, it's at first it's disturbing or difficult to understand how what could it mean to have the knees forward and away when the knees in the door exercise needs to stay in place, because we've seen the door exercise, the person is standing with the heels about 12 inches away from the door, or just a touch less to make it possible. And if the person bends the knees in the habitual way, that is by bending the ankle, bending the knees and bending the hips, well, it's impossible to reach the door without throwing yourself backward and fall. Therefore, the door exercise is indicating that we have to learn to bend the knees and hips, maintaining the knee in place. Well, maintaining what I will call from now on the inferior part of the knee. There are two parts in the knee. There is the, of course, femur, the bone of the thigh, and there is the tibia, the bone of the lower leg. And that is the gap between the two is what we call the knee. So when we are going to direct the potential movements of the knee, we have to be very clear whether we are directing the inferior part of the knee movement or the upper part of the knee movement. And so you will see that it's necessary in order to understand knees forward and away, in order to understand the relationship between knees forward and away and the door exercise where the knee is not moving. It's important to introduce a new word, a new concept. And I do that with every one of my students, the concept of potential movement. I will use this question to introduce the concept as I would introduce it to any one of my students. So first of all, I've prepared some slides, and I want to share the slides. So I need to certainly readjust. I had no time to do it, and so let's readjust so that we have a good view. And so the door exercise and the concept of potential movements, I found them because I studied the door exercise, and so that will help us also to establish a meaning for the instructions, a very old instruction that was called knees forward and away. So I've started by, I wanted to show that knees forward and away, or the knees forward direction, is not an invention on my part. For example, here I cite the teacher I really like, Irene Tasker, first generation teacher. She was trained directly by Alexander. She was his secretary. And what she's saying here is shown on the screen. I will just say it. This balance between the head forward direction and the body back direction and knees forward direction seems to illustrate what Arthur Koestler called the balance between impulse and inhibition. She adds very interesting comments. Inhibition as such can be as harmful as any overemphasis. The body back as the counter check to the leading direction, head forward and up, and knees forward and away, is inhibition counter-checking impulse, that is energizing, under control. So Well, energizing, under control. I took some pictures so that you could get an idea of what we could mean. For example, on the right-hand side, it's a very well-known part of the film where Alexander is seen giving a lesson to young Irishman. Well, it's 4 years before his death, so he's the elderly Alexander here. And what he's seen performing is to have the student lean back. And you will see that the student is leaning back, but there is something you must understand. Alexander is not holding the student in place. The student is supposed to energize and control. This is supposed to be a representation of what the student could do on his own. Is not supported back by Alexander's hands. Alexander's hands are not placed there to support the weight of the student. The student here is in charge of the movement. That's very old 300 BC statue of the archer is clearly supporting his own weight, is using his own weight for a purpose. So here, Alexander is asking the student to energize and control. And so on the student picture, you don't see the knees. But I suspect that the knees, directions of movement, are part of this picture. That is, you cannot lean back so far without any intention or decision of movement for the knee. If you don't, what will be seen is that as soon as the student is leaning back, you will see the inferior part of the knee move backward with the torso. If that is done with enough momentum, the person will fall. And you will see the heel go off the floor very soon. So, can be necessary to understand that this is energizing and control. There must be some sort of direction of movements that are opposed, and we see that I have placed different directions of movements, and the direction for the movement of the lower knee is forward. And at the moment, this direction forward, we could say to make a meaningful sentence that is the correct syntax, so that we have a sentence that is meaningful, because knees forward and away, we don't know away from what. So the sentence for a beginner will not make any sense. So for the moment, we can say that it could be possible to imagine the direction of the knees forward and away from the direction, of course, of the hips. The hips are going back. The inferior part of the knee is going forward and away from the hips, but it's also going forward and away from the heel. So you have the knees forward and away from two different movements. And that, I will explain, consists or is necessary to obtain this energizing and control kind or class of movements, class of gesture. So, when you look at Alexander putting his hands on somebody, I always use some sort of image for you to clearly see the difference. I place next to him one of his distant successor, another teacher of the modern Alexander technique that is also placing hands, and there are obvious differences. And the obvious differences is the direction of movement of the upper torso and head, and the direction of movement of the lower rib cage and hips. Alexander is clear, he's directing the lower rib cage backward and the upper rib cage forward. And the modern Alexander teacher apparently has no idea about these directions of movement. She may be thinking head forward and up, certainly, but her head forward and up has nothing to do with the movement of the different parts of the torso. I strongly indicate that for me, These direction of movement of the part of the torso are explaining head forward and up from the lower ribcage front. It's not the head that is forward from the lower ribcage front. It's the lower ribcage that has been rotated. It's a new poise of the chest. But we are going also to discuss the new body pose. That is how the pelvis is directed relatively to the knees. Apparently, the abdomen of that person is drawn forward. Has she got the knees forward and away from the abdomen? Certainly not. It seems that if her knees are directed forward and away, we can imagine it is so because she's an Alexander teacher. Well, apparently, the knees and the abdomen and lower rib cage are directed in the same way. There is no opposition, there is no inhibition of one movement by another. So I'm coming back to Irene Tasker again, because she's quite, she writes quite a lot about the knees forward and away. And it's quite interesting that she's got all sorts of, you will see, philosophical idea. She was talking about the Arthur Koestler first, about this idea of balance between inhibition and action. And now she's coming back to that. And she's saying that a direction can be too much. Directions have to be balanced using connected orders. This is going to be a lead in this explanation. She's saying, that's Irene Tasker speaking, I'm reading from the text on the slide, too much head forward and up means a narrowing. Too much body back means a coupling down. Without the connected order to keep the knees forward, there is no unity of purpose, no reason for the inhibition of impulse, and nothing of the readiness is all. Just a step back in the first generation teacher training course, they had three fundamental or generic orders. The one was upper torso come forward, that very quickly became head forward and up. The second one was back, or very often Alexander used the term body to mean the torso. So body back, yes. And the third one was knees forward and away. Apparently, she's dispensing from the adverb away. It's very strange because I think that when I read Alexander, it's always knees forward and away. And so these three directions are working together to create a general use, and I stress a use of the torso that will lead to expanding the torso. When we look at certain teachers, so I'm quite fond of this picture of first generation teacher, Charles Neal, is seen in his film where he's explaining the application of the Alexander technique to the garden work. And we see him here mowing the grass with an old kind mower that is propelled by human force. And so what we see here, I've added some arrows, and here we can start to see a picture where the inferior part of the knee is exactly above the ankle. That is, we see that the front leg is exactly vertical. The front leg is exactly vertical, that's one thing you can see. Another thing is that you will also notice that the upper rib cage front is also just above the inferior part of the knee and front of the ankle. There seems to be a geometry in this. And the upper torso, neck and head are in fact directed forward. So this gives a very clear benchmark. You see the head forward from the back. You see a very long back from the lower sacrum to thoracic 7. It's the same image all the time. The heels are clearly directed down. And so I have added, a proposal. And you see that this proposal is that it's possible to imagine directing the knees, away from the heels and directing the knees away from the sitting bones. So for the moment, well, that's interesting, but how do you formulate this to a new student? You can say, oh, do like me, or do like him. Or you can try and place the parts of the student with your hands, but it does not convey the concept. So let's go and see how the door exercise is going to help us affirm the necessary mental operations that are necessary to create what we call the concept. The concept is not an intellectual idea in the air. Concept is a tool to solve real problems. So it's necessary to present a real problem to the student for the student to find that if he fails to solve the problem, and he will, let me tell you, it's very interesting that the door procedure is making the pupil fail, obviously, and that can be recorded on the video image so that the student will see himself fail, and he will see that he cannot maintain the knees forward and away from the heels or forward and away from the pelvis, unless he starts to understand that some energizing and some control is required from his decisions. Yeah. And so let's go back. We see here the three phases of physical act. So this is the physical act of going from standing to sitting. There are so many arrows, it's difficult to see what we are talking about. We have a straight person, and the person goes into, well, I use the Delsart word gorilla, but the Alexander technique, we use the monkey name. So standing monkey and landing on the chair. This is not yet sitting. Alexander says that most people, instead of sitting, landing on the chair, they in fact directly fall backward, and as a result, they destroy the purpose of the exercise. So here we have the three ideas, and we see that I'm requesting the student to start thinking of pulling or directing opposite movements. If you have an elastic band and you want to stretch it so that you want to energize the elastic is going to energize, that is to create a pull, only if you stretch the two opposite ends. And so this is done by decisions to direct the movement of different parts away from one another. The simplest thing is to, for example, take the sitting bone spot, take the inferior part of the knee spot, and assign to each of these spots to the other. And in order to represent that direction, you need to create just a straight line. I ask my student to create a straight line from the lower knee to the sitting bones. And to, for example, that can be presented with a stick, a straight stick, and I say, could you place the straight stick below the knee so that it's just above the calf at the back of the knee, and I would like you to now, with the blade of that stick, I would like you to touch the sitting bone on the same side. And therefore, we suddenly represent an imaginary line between the inferior part of the knee and the sitting bone. And then the next question will be, is it possible to imagine directing the movement of the lower knee away from the sitting bone? And is it reciprocally possible to pull or direct the movement of the sitting bone away from the movement of the inferior part of the knee, which we have already discussed? And in that case, we would say two sentences. One is that if you succeed, we will have the knees directed forward and away from the sitting bone. And the second sentence, and we will have the sitting bone directed back and up away from the inferior part of the knee. Well, yeah. And then let's come back to this idea of, well, the perfect poise in standing and the perfect poise in the door exercise. That is, we have a student is well accomplished and is going to bend. And as you can see, he's bending, and I have set the model next to the picture of the student, and I'm going from one that is standing to the other, which is bending the knee in the new way. And bending in the new way is exactly what you need, what is requested to succeed in, well, performing the door exercise. That is, we see that the person is clearly in one gesture, all together, is directing the movement of the knees and the lower sacrum, but here is directing also the knees and the heels, because you can have the heels forward and away from the heels as well, and that is going to be requested in order to maintain poise while leaning back to incline the torso at 24 degrees. That's the door exercise, regulation. Yeah, and so we see something is that for me, this student is using the concept of knees forward and away. And obviously, it's not easy to understand because we were discussing the fact that there was a direction for the movement of the inferior part of the knee. And when you look at the person performing the action, it's quite obvious that the inferior part of the knee is staying in place. It's in the inhibition of the movement of the inferior part of the knee is perfect. Well, yeah, the student is not bending the ankle at all. So the knee, the inferior part of the knee is not going forward in space. And as well, when the whole weight of the pelvis and torso is going back, we see that the inferior part of the knee somehow resists that motion, and the knees are stay exactly in space, exactly where they are. So how do you reconcile this with the idea of the direction of movement of the knees forward and away? Some of my students are quite anxious to understand the words we're using, and rightly so. So what do we mean by knees forward and away? This is where we need to introduce a new word, which is plural, potential movements. What do we mean by knees forward and away? So you have here an MRI of the knee, and so this allows me to show clearly what I mean by inferior part of the knee. The inferior part of the knee can be located, of course, on the tibia bone, while the superior part of the knee is the lower end of the femur bone. But now, the MRIs allow also to understand that the knee is not just bones. There are different structures, different padding, and there are many strong, binding mechanisms that are binding the superior part of the knee and the inferior part of the knee together. Yeah? And so we start to see what the arrows could mean. Energizing could mean that it's possible to direct the inferior part of the knee movement forward against another movement. That is, we are not imagining knees forward and away in isolation in any way. It would never work. You have to relate the direction of the movement to other directions of movement. So for example, here, you can have the inferior part of the knee directed forward and up, away from the heel, while the heel is directed down. And the heel is not the same bone as the tibia. It's obvious that between the tibia and the heel, there is the calcaneum. There is what we call the ankle joint. And so we have a complex system, and it's absolutely possible to create a visible movement of the heel going away from the inferior part of the knee. So the movement can, often for students that don't understand, ask them to sit and place their feet on the pedestal so that the front of the foot is above the floor and the heel is in the air. And then I ask them to direct the movement of the heel back and down, away from the big toe, it's going to stretch the plantar fascia, it's going to stretch the sole of the foot. Yeah, but it's going to also create a movement where the inferior part of the knee that is connected along the chain with the heel is going to start going, of course, back and down with it. So the pupil on the video recording will see the heel move. So the movement will be, we direct the heel down and it's moving. So it's like a necessary confirmation. I wanted to see something happen when I was directing the heel down. We are going to try and pass. We are going to try and make that need of physical action corresponding to a movement disappear. And this is how. We can ask the student to repeat the operation when the front foot is on the pedestal and to move the heel. Well, prepare the movement of the heel back and down as he did earlier. So this has a stretch, this has a stretching action on all the muscle and fascia. Muscle are red, fascia are blue. So we see part of them, the most important ones. And so you must imagine that there is a stretch when you get the heels to move back away from the inferior part of the knee. But then it's possible also, under the condition of the experiment, with the film set on the side of the pupil, to see whether it could be possible to elicit a movement of the heel back when the knee is not, when the inferior part of the knee is not moving back. And suddenly the student will suddenly discover that it's possible to oppose the movement of the inferior part of the knee to the movement of the heel. And then we go a step further and we start to say, you know what? The heel is on the floor. So as the weight that is applied on it, we call the load, is quite important, the floor is going to prevent the heel to move down, despite that you're, in fact, giving consent to the same direction of movement of the heel away from the knee. The floor is not going to absorb. It's going to resist. It's going to tend to create a reactive force in the opposite direction. Yeah, but the person is really directing the movement of the heel back and down. It's not an imaginary action. We are not in the fanciful world of directing, I don't know, in the mind. No. We are directing movements. And so there will be an antagonistic action, and so the student can understand that he can, in fact, create some sort of energizing, but also a control. So the control is going to become quite important, because when the student go from standing with the knees activated, already the student is directing the inferior part of the knee away from the heel, and he's starting to think of moving the sitting bone. The idea is to go toward the wall. Here, the idea is to go above the chair in order to be able to sit. And so the student is going to energize the knees forward and away from the heels, and forward and away from the sitting bone, and we will check whether then it's possible for the pupil to show an inferior part of the knee that is not moving. This inhibition of the movement of the knee, well, posits or affirms this student's capacity to direct opposite movements to obtain control. So now the control is physical. You will see the person go from standing to monkey very fast, and you will marvel and say, oh dear, he's leaving his knees alone. The knees are not moving. That was an expression Alexander was using. Leaving something alone, not moving it. Yeah, but when everything else and much bigger pieces are moving, how do you satisfy the condition of leaving the inferior part of the knee alone? In fact, it's not by trying to leave it alone. It's really by engaging your capacity to direct what we call potential movement. So what is a potential movement? A potential movement is a movement that would be seen, that would be visible if other conditions were not present. For example, if the floor was ice or really slippery, you would see a movement when the student is energizing the lower leg action, and you would see the heel moving back, really. Yeah. Or if the floor under the heel was really soft, like wet sand, you would see the heel pressed down more. Yeah. Yeah, but you won't see anything because this floor is not slippery, and this floor is not any is resisting any sort of mechanical action downward. You won't see a thing. Yes, but why? Well, because these conditions are in place, and also because the inferior part of the knee is opposed to it. Why are you not seeing the sitting bones going back and up away from the inferior part of the knee? Well, that's a difficult one because, in fact, if the student is really energizing, you will see that the student is not pulling, pressing down. There is some sort of lift going on, so there is something to be seen. But in fact, the knee is your benchmark. The knee is not moving, absolutely. And so the student goes into, there is the impulse, yeah, but there is the inhibition at the same time. You look at the knees and you try and see whether they're moving or not, and they are not. So something is clearly happening that is not usual. Why am I saying this? Because when a student, a new student, he's already gained some directions of movement. He's really much more upright than he was when he finished his training course. He started having lessons with me, and he was never standing like this. But now he's got the model. He knows how to do it, and I'm starting exactly to explain the concept of knees forward and away, and the concept of potential movement that allow energizing and control, so that the knees should not be seen moving. And look, he's not even 3/5 away. He's not even 28 centimeters away from the wall. Because he's a beginner, so I make it easier. And I say, you're just going to try and get your hips back, so the sitting bones are going to go back. They are going to go toward the wall. You need to rest on the wall with them, and you are going to try to maintain the knees forward and away. And when he does, if you look, you will see different things. You will see that the calves are really going back. He's losing the knees forward and away. He's not able yet to energize sufficiently, so his knees are not touching the front of the seat anymore. He's going back, yes. And not only that, but we can see that the front of what I call the armpit line front, which is, if you try and use your index finger as a pencil, you can set this index finger in the opposite armpit. And from there, you want to draw a line crossing the upper chest to the opposite armpit. That line will be crossing the chest at a certain height, and in the center of this armpit line front, you have the sternum bone. And so, in all these models, there is that spot that is marked where we have the armpit height, and we see that when we follow the model, the student is not only maintaining or controlling and energizing the inferior part of the knee above the ankle, is also doing more or less the same application of the concept of potential movement with the front of the armpit line. The front of the armpit line is clearly staying above the knee. It's another condition. And in that case, if the student is able to create a potential movement of the sacrum back and away from the armpit line center, what you will see is that the person is going to extend the torso away from the lower sacrum. So Alexander says extending the torso away from the wall. Yes, but I look at what is in contact with the wall. When you succeed in connecting the wall without falling, when you're succeeding in connecting the wall without the knees moving either forward or back, when you're succeeding connecting the wall, when the center of the armpit line is not going forward or back, then you have a perfect gorilla monkey gesture. And you have the torso extending from the wall, that is extending from the point of contact. From there, you can continue. You have normally something like 25 or 24 degrees angle between the wall and your back. It's possible to check it. It's possible to check where you are. It's possible to check how far you are, where the sitting bones are. It's possible to see whether the inferior part of the knee has moved back or forward. It's possible to see whether the armpit line has moved back or forward. If not, this is the shape you have. And in order to obtain it, you will find that it's absolutely essential, not only to direct the inferior part of the knee forward and away from the sitting bones and directing the armpit line forward and away from the lower sacrum. It's also absolutely necessary to have the head and neck free to move forward relatively to the vertical of the knee and lower rib cage. The knee is necessary, okay? The back, so that you must notice that when going into flexion, the person is going back with the back. There is no idea of going forward with the abdomen, with the lower rib cage. The person is really going back. The words have meaning. We are not discussing back as if it was some sort of concept in the air without experimental confirmation or control. No. You're really discussing going back. We are really discussing making sure that we maintain a model and that the syntax is correct. That is, it produces meaningful solutions for practical situation. The person is learning to go from standing to monkey or sitting with the back extending away from the sacrum. The person is just learning to lengthen the torso all the time, no matter what the conditions are, what the movement is. And so we will see that during that action, the inferior part of the knee, that what you're seeing at the moment, I've changed the image so that you could see the representation of the top of the tibia bone that I use as a label, saying this is the inferior part of the knee, and you have got the superior part of the knee, and it's a very interesting mechanical system where we have a lever system with a wheel at the back of the femur. And so we see that the direction forward and away is essential to stabilize and energize the lower knee when you're bending, when the hips are going back in space. Yeah. I have prepared also for you to understand a bit better a few images. I've just taken pictures from a session with one of my students. And so the student is coming and is asked to stand. There is a wall behind him, and I'm asking him to manipulate a chair. The back of the chair is in front of him. And so at the moment he's looking at the chair. He's not energizing much, as you can see. He's pulling down, I would say. But clearly he knows in 2 seconds how to organize himself. And we see that suddenly, instead of having the hips and the thighs a bit far forward and the shoulder a bit far back, that's immediately changed. And in 2 seconds, you can get a vertical of unity at the front of the torso. You see more or less the ankle, the lower knee, the pubic bone, lower rib cage, and more or less the ear. The ear is still further back at the moment, and that's why there is a red arrow. The arrows pointing back are most of the time purple, and the wrong ones are red. And so we are going to start to establish this condition in standing. In standing, we are going to try to see whether it's possible to get the inferior part of the knee directed forward, while the superior part of the knee movement is directed back. For most people, this is completely strange and new. What? You can direct the inferior part of the knee movement forward and direct the superior part of the knee back. At first, without some sort of introduction or experimental introduction, the student will not make sense of that kind of directions of movements, because for them the knee is the knee. When you move the inferior part of the knee back, the superior part of the knee moves back, and you get an hyperextension of the knee. If you move the inferior part of the knee forward, the superior part of the knee moves forward with it, and you get the bending. The only way they can conceive bending is by going forward with both the superior and inferior part of the knee. For them, the idea of bending without moving the inferior part of the knee forward, what? Makes no sense, and it's for them they can't they have such difficulty representing it. Well, first of all, because it's not part of their habitual experience, therefore their sensory appreciation has no clue on how to direct that kind of movement. And that's why I think Alexander used that door exercise. That's why the Delsart teachers, much before him, were using the door exercise. It's because it's necessary to decompose the habitual movements of the superior and inferior part of the knee, so that the student can start to realize that, wow, yes, it is rational to direct the inferior part of the knee forward and the superior part of the knee back. But that's not a given. During the session, even if you follow these talks and interviews with Kevin and me, you may understand somehow the concept of antagonistic action and what is potential movement. That is, I am directing the movement in the inferior part of the knee forward, because if I do not do that, as soon as I'm going to go back with the hips, the knees are going to be seen to move backward on the video recording. So having had this experiment time and again, being caught one more time with the inferior part of the knee going forward when you wanted it to stay in place because you forgot that it's the new bending of the knee and not the old one, the one you're familiar with. So you have to accept an unfamiliar feeling when you're bending. But second, you're also caught having, once you have accepted that it's a new bending of the knee, now you will see that when the hips are going back, suddenly the inferior part of the knee is going back with it. That is seen on the video recording. And most of the time, because of it, you're losing your balance and falling. So you have no questions whether it was going back or not. It was really going back. In order not to fall, when you reach a door that is 12 inches away, well, let's say 10 inches away, that's enough, without falling, you need to understand knees forward and away from the heels and knees forward and away from the hips. When the hips are going back, when the sitting bones are going back, it's absolutely necessary to engage in your mind a decision. Use a movement, it's a decision of movement that is going to somehow extend the thigh and resist the motion of the lower rib cage and lower torso backward. So this is what the student is, so you see, the student wants just to start to go back with the hips, and when he goes back with the hips, you see that the inferior part of the knee is going back with it. You see something else also. You see that there is a green arrow with a knot, some sort of cross that is saying is not allowing the neck to be free to move forward. When the hips are moving forward, backward as requested to touch the wall, look at the neck. The neck is going back in space. Going back in space means that the neck shows no sign of direction of movement forward of the blue line. There is a blue line on the ankle. This is what we are looking at. Is it possible to touch the wall without the neck being free to move forward? The answer is simple. No. No way. You have to find a solution to get the upper torso to move forward relatively to the blue line. Otherwise, you cannot touch the wall without falling backward. This door exercise is fantastic. You have everything under your eyes. Well, not. Meaning that at the moment when you see the person starting to go back, you see that most people won't see that there is a direction backward for the head and the neck. It's only when the students become capable of directing the neck and the head forward that you start to realize that this picture is showing a person that is resisting, is trying not to go forward. Because he doesn't want to go forward with the armpit line, his only solution for the moment, he hasn't got yet this understanding of the rotation of the rib cage, where the lower rib cage can go back and the upper rib cage can go forward. As a result, he's not going forward. As a result, it's impossible in this condition to reach the wall without falling backward. The knee is going back, the armpit line is going back, the person is going to fall. This is not control. This is not energizing and control. This is losing it and falling backward. And so we need to realize this, and I have a way sometimes when it's going like that, and I think that it's going to be too costly to try again. It's better to start from the finishing idea. So I ask the student to do whatever he wants, and you see he's falling and he's arching his back. You see that the center of the lumbar region is going very fast backwards, and is rotating. That is, the distance between the inferior part of the knee and the sitting bone is too short. He's not pulling the knees forward and away from the sitting bone, and he's not pulling the sitting bone back and up away from the knees. No, they're coming toward each other, and as a result, this is rotating his pelvis too much. Therefore, he's not arching forward, certainly. No, he's arching back now. Yeah, and so despite this idea, I say, well, you have the sitting bone on the wall now. And you can touch the center of the armpit line. You know, drawing the line from one armpit to the other, finding the center of it on the sternum. And you say, the top of the chair represents more or less where the front of the ankle is. Yes, the front of the ankle, we draw a vertical line, and you say, would it be possible for you to pull the front of the armpit line forward and away from the lower sacrum? And I've traced an extended blue line that represents what the student is supposed to try and perform. I'm asking the student to extend the torso away from the lower sacrum. Why not? You will see what happens. So the student tries, and at first, obviously, very much the sitting bones toward the inferior part of the knee is certainly not directing the inferior part of the knee forward away from the sitting bone. They are still very far back. Hence, the result cannot be satisfactory. We see that the student, in order to bring the armpit line above the top of the chair, is completely collapsing the torso. Okay, fine. But from there, we start to discuss what it would mean if now that he's in place, now that he's safe, he doesn't have too much to initiate. From there, I can ask him, well, could you try and think again and try to imagine a straight line from the lower sacrum on the wall to the armpit line, and could you stretch? And apparently the student can. And he is suddenly performing a new action. Okay, and we see some sort of direction of the lower sacrum away from the armpit line, and the armpit line away from the lower sacrum. But that is going to help me, because if you look at the sitting bones, they are going away from the inferior part of the knee. And suddenly, if you look at the inferior part of the knee, you will see that the inferior part of the knee is starting to go away. You see, there is an energizing going on. It's not sufficient, but it's starting. There is something possible. So it seems that in order to obtain the knees forward and away, you need to obtain the lengthening of the torso, and also to obtain the length of the torso, you need to obtain knees forward and away from the sitting bones. There are interactive order, connected orders. That's connected orders. That's what Irene Tasker description. And that is what we mean by connected orders. And so we continue with that, and we start to see how much the pupil can. So at first, when the pupil tries to energize more, on one side, he's losing on the other. So the knee is going back. But it doesn't matter. We continue, and we start having both actions at the same time. It is not easy for a student to, well, connect actions. Connecting orders is already difficult. Connecting action? Well, it's another ball game. And so from connecting orders, you can go to connecting action, but it's not because you're connecting orders that suddenly it's easy to connect actions. No, no, no. It's a decisions of movement. And this has to be trained. So this student is training his capacity to connect orders and connect the actions that are corresponding. And the actions are complex because they are opposite directions of movement. It's not focusing on anything that is going to help. And so the pupil is starting to establish the condition of knees forward and away and back to extend away from the sacrum at the same time. And when it's starting to happen, suddenly you start to see something is that the neck and the head are further forward than the vertical line of the ankle. And so this is the student is now in charge of the control. He knows more or less what are the essential instructions and orders necessary to obtain energizing and control so that he can go from standing to gorilla, well, much more easily. And so we will see that when he's going, the knees are moving, but not so much. They are moving back, but not too much. So this is the way one can teach long distance. I've never met that person physically. That person is, I don't know, 7,000 kilometers away from my home. And that person is starting to learn how to use a model in order to understand concepts that are not physical, concepts that are not, you cannot feel these concepts, knees forward and away, you can never feel it. You can never feel at the same time knees forward and away from the heels, from the lower sacrum, and from the armpit line, which is the requested connected orders that the pupil is starting to use. And so the pupil starts to become capable of controlling and energizing the standing and every step of the bending procedure. This is constructive conscious guidance and control. And this explained both knees forward and away, and also what I mean by potential movement, movement that you will not see, but that just the student decisions are clearly activating. That's
okay. One analogy I like for understanding potential movements and antagonistic actions and antagonistic pulls is with an elastic band. So you imagine you have an elastic band or get one, and you pull the hands apart and then you stop somewhere. So someone's looking, your hands look like they're not moving, you know, in the same way as the knee looks like it's not moving. But if you let go of one hand, the elastic band, in reaction to the movement you were doing, the potential movement will ping across the room. So
exactly.
It shows you that it can look like it's not moving in one sense, but it's actually been kept still because of multiple movements with the elastic band. It's your hands moving apart and the elastic resisting. So that's a good way to think about it also. Also, you said, for people watching the video, we've done a lot of videos in the past or a few videos in the past on antagonistic pulls, antagonistic actions, opposition of movements. So you might want to look at those old episodes as well. It's useful for understanding this. Okay, so if you want to book a lesson with Jeando, there's a link underneath, and we'll see everybody in the next video. Thank you, Jeando.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye.
Bye-bye.